We'll go now to the Canadian Constitution Foundation, and we have Christine Van Gyn, who is the litigation director on Zoom here. So, Christine, for 5 minutes, please, your opening statements.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me today. I'm the litigation director with the CCF, which is a legal charity that fights for fundamental freedoms in Canada. And I am fascinated by the question that's been proposed by the committee today, which is the means government should have at its disposal to ensure the exercise of freedom of expression. And frankly, the government does not need more means. The government needs to do less. We already have the right to freedom of expression guaranteed in Section 2B of the Charter. Before the Charter, we had the right to freedom of expression protected in the Constitution Act 1867, which is similar in principle to the United Kingdom, whose unwritten constitution protects the right of public discussion. We are not granted these rights to freedom of expression by our government. We possess them by virtue of being human beings. And throughout human history, it's the government that's the greatest threat to our right to free speech, whether it was the execution of Socrates for his public philosophy, or the brutal Star Chamber of King Henry VII, who punished those who printed without a license, or the attempted censorship of New York newsman Peter Zenger for his criticism of the American colonial government. Governments have tried to censor speech that they don't like as long as we have had governments. And it's hard for me to even know where to start on this question. Do I talk about the threat to freedom of the press, the problem with imprisoning people for words alone, the problem with using human rights tribunals to regulate art and comedy, or, as Dr. G brought up, how professional regulators are undermining the right of freedom of speech of so many Canadians in those professions? These are all real, live issues today, and the source of the problem is government. On free press, consider the Alberta press case, which involved a law that compelled newspapers to publish government rebuttals to criticism. That case was from 1937, so fears about the so-called fake news or misinformation are not new. But even though the Supreme Court struck down that Alberta law, the silencing of the press continues today. For example, we at the CCF challenged an amendment to the Canadian Elections Act it ended up being struck down in 2019. That was a provision that prohibited the false statements about political candidates during an election period, and it even captured innocent statements and mistakes and had fines up to $50,000 and 5 years in prison. We were successful in having it struck down. And while not censorship in the classic sense, millions of Canadians have lost access to news because of this government's Online News Act, done in the name of saving the news industry. The act has backfired spectacularly, with Meta refusing to comply and blocking news on its platforms. There's the Online Streaming Act brought by this government, which put the CRTC in charge of regulating content from companies like YouTube, Netflix, and Spotify, including user-generated content. And the free press is essential. It's an essential check on the authoritarian impulses of government, and the actions of this government continue to undermine it. On the criminal law power, censorship through criminalizing words is nothing new, even though we're well aware of the problems with it. Consider Quebecois Jehovah's Witness Amy Boucher, who in the 1940s was convicted of seditious libel for accusing the Quebec government of being too close to the Catholic Church. That is a viewpoint that was condemned at the time, but perhaps mainstream today. And consider how expressing the idea that gay people should have equal rights was an unacceptable view 60 years ago, but thanks to the free speech of people who publicly advocated for change, we have equal rights now in Canada for the LGBTQ community. Free speech is important for those who are in minorities, whether they're a minority viewpoint or a minority in some immutable characteristic. Free speech is how we define the contours of our other rights. It is not a value for the right or the left. It is a nonpartisan right for all Canadians, yet this government continues to undermine it. One of the purposes of free expression is to allow for debate on even the most controversial topics, because vigorous debate is how we best settle our disagreements, including disagreements about who should lead government. Free debate on contentious issues can't happen if the people currently in government are allowed to outlaw opposing point of views. The right to express your words and ideas goes to the core of who we are as individuals. The government doesn't need more means. It needs to stop trying to silence speech.